Welcome back to Salt City Counseling. If you're new here, my name is Scott. I'm a licensed therapist here in the beautiful state of Utah. And this video, the topic of this video has to do with high conflict custody and divorce. I'm going to talk about an issue that, more of an oddity really, that I've seen surfaced a lot more recently. It's become a lot more common. I'm going to talk about kids landing in front of a occupational therapist, high conflict types, taking them to an occupational therapist instead of a real therapist, and some of the dubious diagnosing that takes place. I think it might be a little close to the mic. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about sensory processing disorder, or SPD, in this video. There's a little bit of an issue here. I've seen this happen and come up a lot more in the last year. Keeps coming up. I keep seeing that kids are going to occupational therapists now and not real therapists. But I'll get into it. First, just a wee bit of housekeeping. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I am planning some live events for those of you that are here for the high conflict, content. I'm actually planning a live webinar. I believe we're going to do September 4th. So look for videos having to do with my live event on September 4th. Specifically going to be talking about how high conflict types are weaponizing mental health professionals and using them against you, and how that works, why they're doing it, how that's happening, and some of the things you might be able to do about it. Okay, so stay tuned for that. Okay, we're going to talk about that in the future. So let's get to the topic. So like I said, I've been seeing more and more. So people will hire me for consultation and coaching purposes. I'm not able to provide therapy outside of state lines, but I am able to be basically a consultant or a coach in regards to just sort of reviewing cases. And so people hire me and they ask for my perspective on situations, and they'll send me, have me review information having to do with their kids, and behavior concerns with their kids and such. And more in the last year, I have been seeing kids being taken to an occupational therapist. Usually they're younger. Usually the kids are younger, under the age of 12, normally on 12, 13-ish range, or younger, are being put in front of occupational therapists instead of real therapists. The difference being that it's my understanding that occupational therapists, their primary job is to basically help those who have developmental disabilities, low functioning autism, or people that have like brain injuries or whatever, help them improve their overall functioning, whether it's like holding a job and working a job and doing what's called ADLs, or activities of daily living, hygiene, making food, cleaning, that type of stuff. It's been my understanding that is their primary function, or that has been their primary function, is to help that crowd. But now, apparently, a lot of these high conflict types are taking their kids to the occupational therapist and basically kind of recruiting them. Now, I've seen this more times over the years than I can count, and that is that the high conflict types, the narcissists, the high conflict borderline moms, they're really good at shopping around and basically finding professionals that they can recruit as to be their henchmen, right? And to join their side and to take their side on things. And with all due respect to the OTs, the occupational therapists, they are probably way, way, way easier to manipulate and recruit in this regard. They're frankly, no offense to you guys, if there are any of you out there watching this, you are way, way in over your head when it comes to parents who have personality disorders, and parents who are narcissistic, partners who are using professionals as pawns, or trying to find professionals to use as pawns in their custody case. Okay, and and I think occupational therapists just have a huge giant bullseye on their back. Okay, there's a few issues with this, and I wanted to specifically talk about this diagnosis called sensory processing disorder, or SPD. And it's weird because in the last year or so, I have seen many kids that are getting labeled or diagnosed with this particular disorder. of sensory processing disorder. Now, from what I can from what I've gathered, because I did some research on it, I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with it because I wasn't familiar with it. I'd seen there were like kids who were being labeled with this, and it was new. And I was like, I don't know much about this one. So I did my research on it. Here's what I found basically that SPD is originally supposed to be some sort of specifier for those who are struggling with, they're just lower functioning. And it's supposed to be kind of a specifier that particularly lower functioning autism, that sensory input is overwhelming and they have a hard time processing that. Sounds weird to me when I say it, that input, right? So the trouble here, right, is this is supposed to be I think reserved just for those who are struggling with their basic functioning, and then we're labeling kids with this disorder. It's not a so here's what I found. Okay, SPD does not exist. It's not a real disorder. There is no diagnostic criteria. That was one of the main questions that I asked was, what is the diagnostic criteria for SPD? And I even asked ChatGPT, and I did this just the other day just to see if there had been an update on this, because I did some research originally. What is the diagnostic criteria for SPD? There is none. It does not exist. SPD does not, it's not in the DSM, and it's not in the ICD. There is no diagnostic criteria. It's not a real disorder, and it doesn't exist. Okay, so if your child has been labeled with SPD, well, you ought to be pushing back. You ought to be saying this isn't a real diagnosis. If there's a therapist, master's level therapist like me, or a PhD psychologist that has provided this diagnosis, you might want to think about reporting them. Not that we're trying to get them fined or suspended or have hurt their career. It's not egregious enough. But they need to hear from the higher-ups that, hey, this is not a real diagnosis, okay? Don't just defer to an occupational therapist for a diagnosis, because that's where it's coming from, is the occupational therapist is saying, oh, they have SPD. So here in my world, kids are acting out or having behavior issues, and I do that in quotation marks, not only because it's fun for me, but because I'm sick and tired. I'm an expert in child behavior, but also especially adolescent behavior. I'm sick and freaking tired of normal childhood behaviors and normal childhood development being labeled as a problem and an issue, particularly by the HCBMs, the high conflict borderline moms, who just want a compliant child. And so often too, though, the kids acting out or the kids having behavior issues, lots of anxiety, maybe there's some aggression in there, whatever, that kid is responding to their environment, the environmental factors. Well, rather than looking at the parent being like, well, what are you doing? Because this kid is obviously responding to the issues that you're having, right? Because we all know that if we do that, if we say that to the high conflict borderline mom, for example, she's going to say, I don't like that therapist, and yank the kid and find someone who will agree with her, or find someone that she can basically boss around. By the way, my live event that I'm going to be having the first week of September, the first Wednesday of September, is going to talk in more detail about these professionals who are finding themselves on the receiving end of some of this manipulation and such, right? But back to what I was saying. Okay, so these kids are basically being labeled as deficient or defective. This is one of the reasons why I have a big problem with ADHD, is that kids are going through normal emotions. They sometimes have trauma, they sometimes have anxiety, they sometimes have all kinds of things going on with them. And we shouldn't just say, oh, you have ADHD because you're defective, you're deficient, you have a deficiency. Boys especially are accruing these diagnoses like ADHD and SPD, because what I've learned is that boys like to learn about the world by interacting physically with it. That's how boys understand things, is by physically interacting with it. Girls are different in that they interact with things through their words and through their emotions. Neither is good nor bad, neither is right nor wrong. And the reason why I said that is we live in this crazy time where it seems like there's a lot of wrong information out there about boys and girls, okay? But all of that being said, What I find is that boys more commonly get labeled or diagnosed with ADHD and now SPD, and being diagnosed as somehow deficient or having a disorder because I think what is happening is like teachers, female teachers, or high conflict borderline moms, they want a quiet, compliant kid. And if he's getting up and he's trying to learn about his world by physically interacting with it, he's labeled as a problem, and he's diagnosed with a whole bunch of disorders. And this is particularly destructive because I'm highly, highly opposed to putting it into kids' minds that they're deficient or they're defective. And if you tell a kid, if a kid grows up believing that they're deficient or defective, they will only see limitations in their lives, okay? They will always see themselves as incapable. And so be advised, for those of you out there that are in high conflict divorce or custody situations, don't be surprised if suddenly, instead of a therapist or instead of a psychologist, you're seeing an occupational therapist. Okay, so the fact of the matter is, you can, if you have custodial rights, you can contact the occupational therapist and say, "Hey, listen, I'm not approving of your interventions or your treatment, and I'm terminating treatment. I'm terminating this." Okay, in many instances, you have the legal right to do so, and they could be out of compliance. They could get basically censored by the licensing board if they continue treatment when you've told them to cut it off, right? But be advised, be warned that if your kid might walk in and be like, "Oh, I have SPD." And you're like, "What?" And so it's not a diagnosis. Feel free to tell other professionals, feel free to tell other parents. SPD is not a real diagnosis. There is no diagnostic criteria. Without a diagnostic criteria, it's not a real disorder. It doesn't exist. Okay, but this is a very, very loaded topic. I'm going to cover some more of this in greater detail in my live event. So again, stay tuned for that. And be sure to push back. If you see an occupational therapist, if this is a very complex case and a complex kid with lots of complex behavior patterns, be sure to push back and say, "No, this is not right." Okay? So let me know what you think. Put your comments below, your questions. I'll do my best to respond to them. I've kind of struggled with that lately, I'll be honest. I've been keeping myself busy with a lot of different projects. But thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.